So let's look a little bit more details on the evolution of oxygen and the early life. So we said the first life forms were probably heterotrophs, but by the time the first autotrophs evolved, they were probably similar to the modern anaerobic bacteria that survive without oxygen. Why? Because as we said, there's pretty clear evidence that early atmosphere 3.5 billion years ago did not have much oxygen. We have to also remember, if we argue that the life evolved in the ocean, then we also have to worry about dissolved oxygen in the ocean. And even for that, we have some evidence about when the oceans got oxygenated. I won't go into the details of the evidence, but it has chemical depositions that are related to amount of oxygen in the water and so on. So chemosynthesis from chemicals at deep hydrothermal vents would have been the main mode of autotrophy, which means that's how they got their energy. So even now, if we look at the hydrothermal vents, the water is full of sulfuric acid. It's very toxic. Typically they are deep and there is no light, and yet there is lots of bacteria that survive in that. That studies for its own sake, because that also gives you a sense of what kind of extreme environments could support life, because if you're going to look for life elsewhere on Europa or Enceladus or Mars or whatever, you would want to know what is the potential range of conditions, chemical and physical conditions under which life could survive, even if it didn't evolve there. So chemosynthesis at from chemicals at deep hydrothermal vents is possible because there is a lot of energy in the water that's available there. So this supports the idea that life probably did originate in the deep ocean in the absence of life. Again, absence of light. Again, remember that we are talking about collecting data, building a hypothesis, and collecting more data to test the hypothesis. So these are still heading towards building a hypothesis based on the data we have. So it's not even close to being a theory yet. But nonetheless, once autotrophs evolved, eventually we got photosynthesis and respiration. So complex autotrophs developed chlorophyll, which can capture light, which harvests light. So if you think about it in terms of solar energy, all the leaves that you see around are basically solar cells. They are capturing solar energy and producing carbohydrates by combining water and CO2. So this allowed the sun to be used for photosynthesis, and mitochondria drove cellular respiration, which means the carbohydrate that was produced was split back into CO2 and water to produce energy for movement, for reproduction, for running away from predators, and so on and so forth. So to briefly look at this, sorry the title got cut off, but it just says photosynthesis and respiration. So photosynthesis is essentially sunlight hitting water and carbon dioxide, producing sugar and oxygen, whereas respiration is the opposite, where the energy is released by breaking down carbohydrates into water and breaking down sugar and oxygen into carbon dioxide and water. So we breathe oxygen. We need oxygen. All aerobic life forms require oxygen to burn sugar to produce carbon dioxide and water, right? So if you put it in terms of chemical reactions, 6 molecules of H2O combine with 6 molecules of CO2 and require light energy. And the photosynthesis produces C6H12O6, which is a polymer of carbohydrate or sugar, and it releases oxygen. But you have to remember that all animals also respire, so plants produce oxygen, but they also burn their carbohydrates to grow and reproduce and have flowers and seeds and so on. So they consume oxygen as well. So that's respiration, which produces CO2 and H2O back. We'll see later on that every molecule of carbohydrate that you hide away from respiration adds a molecule of oxygen or 6 molecules of oxygen to the system. So whatever is respired back is not releasing oxygen to the system, but whatever is hidden away. So in that sense, carbon sequestration or unrespired carbohydrates are important for oxygen levels, but it's these unrespired carbohydrates that also give you fossil fuels. The past photosynthesis that produced carbohydrate and got buried either as coal or natural gas or crude oil and so on, it is that we are now burning and producing energy. So energy doesn't just get produced by respiration, but also by burning as fossil fuel. So when did oxygen evolve then? The evidence we can get chemically, as I said, if oxygen levels increase in the ocean, very briefly speaking, the dissolved iron that is there in the water gets quickly oxidized and you get very heavy depositions of iron. There are things like banded iron formation and so on, which you can look up. That event is recorded about 2.5 billion, 2.45 billion years ago. That's when oxygen rose to levels not as high as today, but about 50% of what is today in the atmosphere at 20%. Increased oxygen and ozone obviously removed the food supply for anaerobic life forms that existed before this oxidation event. And oxygen is actually very toxic. Even now, if oxygen levels go beyond 20 and reach 30%, then we would, of course, burn our lungs, but a lot of things would burn up instantaneously because of lightning and other things. It's very dangerous to have high levels of oxygen in the atmosphere. So cyanobacteria, on the other hand, adapted and thrived because they learned to photosynthesize. So looking at the evolution of oxygen with time, if you look at the right-hand side of the axis, paleoclimate people or people who study past climates typically have the axis going from right to left, unlike we do from left to right. So it's starting 600 million years ago, and you can see the horizontal line that is showing the current level of oxygen, just over 20%. It was below that level. It hit the current level at some point and went down again. This has to do with the evolution of large-scale plants all over the globe, which started to photosynthesize and respire, and there are other ways in which you can reduce oxygen. And it again spiked over the current levels, and then it has spiked again multiple times. But currently, in the last several tens of millions of years, we are in this range of 21% that we consider the standard atmosphere at this time. So photosynthetic organisms are responsible for life as we know, and they're responsible for the atmospheric composition that we have right now. So they reduced CO2 and increased O2 to 21%. So CO2 is now what is called a trace quantity, so it's 0.04% of the atmosphere. Obviously very high CO2 would also make life very difficult for us. So everything is ideal right now. So high oxygen also means biodiversity was helped by this. There are lots of details involved there that we won't go into. But low oxygen events are typically associated with extinction events. So the main thing to remember out of this is that oxygen hasn't always been at this level that it is now, and life has formed a great role in giving us the atmospheric composition and the oxygen levels that we have at this time. So we will visit some of these issues again and again in different contexts, including how fossil fuel burning is affecting the oxygen levels and how it helps us to prove that the changes in CO2 in the atmosphere are in fact related to fossil fuel burning and so on.